It was still early in the morning when the call came through the police station radio. The air inside the small building was calm, and most officers were quietly settling into their routines. The officer who received the call had just taken a sip of tea, expecting the day to be slow like usual. But the message was simple and clear. A retired general living on the outskirts of town reported strange noises in his house the night before and wanted someone to check on it. It sounded like a routine visit, nothing alarming, something that would normally take only a few minutes. Still, the officer knew he had to go. It was part of the job. The officer grabbed his notepad, straightened his uniform, and made his way to the patrol car. The streets were quiet as he drove, the sun slowly rising and lighting up the buildings. The officer wasn't in a rush. In his mind, it was probably a loose window, maybe a bird trapped somewhere, or wind pushing against something outside. Retired officers often felt uneasy about noises in big houses, especially when they lived alone. He understood that, after about 15 minutes of driving, he reached the general's home. It was a large, old-style house with tall walls and a metal gate. The place looked well-maintained, but carried a sense of age, as if it had been standing proudly for decades. The officer stepped out of the car, walked through the gate after it was unlocked remotely, and followed the pathway to the main entrance. The retired general opened the door himself. He looked older but strong, with sharp eyes that suggested he was still very aware of the world around him. He greeted the officer politely and stepped aside to let him in. The inside of the house was quiet, clean, and filled with antique items and framed photographs from the general's service days. The officer took a moment to observe his surroundings, trying to understand the atmosphere of the place. The general didn't waste much time. He explained that he wasn't worried about an intruder. Instead, he was concerned that his old safe alarm had blinked sometime during the night. He didn't hear any doors open or see anyone inside, but the blinking light had shaken him a little because he hadn't touched the safe in a long time. The officer nodded, though he didn't feel worried. He thought maybe the battery in the alarm was low or something inside the safe was shifting. Still, he listened respectfully. The general told him that the safe was in a secure room at the back of the house. He had personally built a special setup around it years ago to protect important documents, medals, and personal things from his service days. The officer assumed it must be a strong, heavy safe like the ones found in old offices. As the general guided him through the hallway, he spoke in a calm but serious tone. He mentioned that long ago, when he was still serving, he had added a small security trap inside the safe. It wasn't dangerous, just a simple paint spray system designed to startle anyone who tried to break into it. It was more of a warning system, something harmless but effective enough to make intruders hesitate. The general had almost forgotten about it, till he saw the blinking alarm. The officer raised his eyebrows slightly but didn't say much. He thought it was amusing, but didn't want to disrespect the general's sense of security. He assumed the trap probably didn't work anymore. After so many years, the pressure would have faded or the mechanism inside would have jammed. Still, he appreciated the general's honesty. They reached the secure room. The officer noticed how different it felt from the rest of the house. The walls were reinforced, the lighting was brighter, and the air felt still, like everything inside had been untouched for a long time. In the center of the room stood the safe. It wasn't a modern digital design, but rather an older, heavy-built one with strong metal hinges and a thick handle. It looked sturdy and reliable. It's a kind of safe that could easily last for decades. The general pointed at the small alarm panel beside it. A tiny red light flashed every few seconds. The officer crouched down to take a closer look. It didn't seem like something recent had happened. There were no signs of forced entry, no scratches on the surface, no shifted items nearby. Still, he knew he had to check everything carefully. He asked the general when he last opened the safe. The general replied that it had been many years. He kept old items inside that carried sentimental value, but he rarely needed them. The safe had remained closed and untouched. The officer nodded again and stood up. He gently tried to examine the lock's exterior. His plan was simple. Make sure nothing looked tampered with. Maybe check the connection to the alarm panel and reassure the general that everything was fine. He didn't plan on opening the safe. He didn't think it was necessary. But the general, wanting to be completely sure. asked the officer if he could check the locking mechanism carefully, just to rule out any problem. The officer didn't mind. He thought it would only take a moment. He reached toward a small latch that sat just beneath the main lock. It looked like a piece of metal covering a hinge or a connector. The officer gently tapped the area with his finger. Nothing happened. He tapped again, a little firmer, thinking maybe it would help him feel loose components inside. He didn't realize that this latch was connected to an internal sensor. The same sensor the general had installed years ago. The general stood nearby, watching closely. He didn't say much, but the officer could sense a mix of curiosity and nervousness in the older man's eyes. The officer leaned closer, squinting a little as he tried to peek into the gap near the lock. The room was silent, almost too silent. He could hear the hum of the light above him, the soft ticking of a clock on the wall, and the slow breathing of the general behind him. He reached out again, thinking maybe he should try shifting the latch slightly to see if the alarm panel reacted. He didn't apply much force, just a small push with his fingertip. The latch moved slightly, only slightly, and that tiny movement was enough. Something inside. The safe made a soft clicking sound. It was faint but sharp, like a spring catching or a switch releasing. The officer froze for a second, unsure of what he had just triggered. He glanced back at the general, who suddenly looked concerned. The general opened his mouth as if to warn him, but the moment was too quick for words. The officer felt a sudden shift of air, a small internal pressure change that he couldn't fully understand. It sounded like something old but functional had just come to life. His body tensed, but he didn't step back. He was still trying to figure out what part of the mechanism had reacted. What he didn't realize was that he had just activated the first part of the general's long-forgotten security trap. The old paint spray system, sealed inside the safe for years, was preparing itself. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dangerous, but it was definitely working again. The officer stayed focused on the safe, unaware that the next few moments would change the calm routine of his day into something completely unexpected. The secure room. The old safe, the blinking alarm, everything felt normal just seconds ago. But the officer could sense that something was shifting. Even if he couldn't yet see it, he took a slow breath, steadying himself. He wanted to make sure the general felt safe and understood what was happening. He didn't turn away. He didn't step back. He simply waited, thinking he could figure out what the clicking sound meant. He had no idea that the real surprise had just begun. The old safe, silent for so long, was waking up its hidden trap, and the officer was standing exactly where he shouldn't be. And in that quiet room, with no warning at all, everything was about to take a very unexpected turn. The soft clicking sound inside the safe still echoed in the officer's mind as he stood there, trying to figure out what had shifted. For a moment, everything felt strangely still, as if the room itself was waiting for something to happen. The officer slowly stepped back, more out of caution than fear, and studied the front of the safe again. Nothing on the outside looked different. The handle hadn't moved, the door hadn't loosened, and the blinking alarm light stayed the same, calm and steady. The retired general stood near the doorway, watching quietly. His expression showed concern, but also a hint of curiosity. It had been many years since he last touched the safe, and even he wasn't sure what the internal mechanisms were capable of anymore. "Are you sure this paint trap of yours isn't still active?" the officer asked gently, turning his head toward the general. The general gave a slow sigh. "It shouldn't be. It's extremely old. I built it a long time ago, and honestly, I doubt the pressure inside is still strong enough to activate anything." The officer nodded but didn't feel fully convinced. The clicking noise sounded too clean, too precise, like something inside had snapped into place exactly the way it was meant to. He took a few steps closer again, kneeling to look at the latch he had touched earlier. He carefully moved his hand toward it, but stopped short of touching it. He didn't want to set off anything unintentionally. The general walked closer and looked at the alarm panel. "The blinking light is unusual," he said softly. "It usually stays a solid red when everything is functioning normally." The officer straightened up and rubbed the back of his neck, "Sir, when did you last check the wiring for this system?" he asked. "Years ago," the general replied. "Maybe more than a decade. I remember installing the trap myself because I didn't fully trust the builders at the time. I wanted something only I understood." The officer smiled slightly. "And it seems like you succeeded." The general let out a small chuckle, though he still looked uneasy. "It was never meant to cause trouble. Just a deterrent. Back then, I didn't want anyone going through my personal items." The officer nodded again, appreciating the honesty. He stepped around the safe, checking every visible part of it. There were no scratches or marks. No dust disturbed. No signs of anyone trying to force it open. "Could the blinking be from a loose sensor?" the officer asked. "Possibly," the general said. "The trap inside was never designed to last forever." The officer crouched again and gently touched the metal surface of the safe. It felt cool and solid. The metal didn't vibrate or move under his hand. Everything seemed normal, still. Something about the clicking sound bothered him. He leaned in slightly and listened, hoping to hear anything else from inside the safe. After a few seconds, he heard another faint noise, this time more like a slow winding. It's almost like an old clock resetting itself. He stiffened, unsure of what the mechanism was doing. He stood up and moved back again. "I think something inside is adjusting," he said quietly. The general stepped closer, now looking more worried. "Adjusting? That doesn't sound right. The trap is only supposed to activate when someone tries to break the lock." The officer raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly counts as breaking the lock in your design?" The general looked at the latch under the lock, the same one the officer had touched. His face showed a sudden moment of realization. That latch. That connects directly to the pressure sensor. If it shifted even a little, the trap might think someone is forcing the lock. The officer blinked, so it could activate. "Possibly," the general said slowly. "But again, it's old. I'm not sure it has enough power left." The officer let out a small breath and stepped farther back from the safe. He didn't want to take chances, even if the trap was harmless. Getting startled wasn't high on his list today. The general gestured toward the far wall. "Maybe you should stand back for a moment," he suggested. The officer moved toward the suggested area and leaned against the wall, arms folded lightly. The general walked to the other side of the room, keeping his distance as well. For a moment, nothing happened. The two stood in silence, both watching the safe like it was a sleeping animal that might suddenly move. The room felt colder, the air heavier. The small blinking light on the alarm panel seemed unusually bright now. The officer cleared his throat gently. "Sir, do you think we should disconnect the alarm system?" The general shook his head. If the trap is halfway activated, disconnecting anything might set it off fully. It's better to wait and let it either settle or finish whatever it's doing. The officer nodded, though he didn't like the uncertainty. Waiting meant standing in the still room, listening to faint noises and hoping nothing sprayed, snapped, or triggered in an unexpected way. A few minutes passed. The safe remained quiet. The officer took a slow breath and relaxed a little. "Maybe it was nothing," he said, but the general wasn't convinced. He walked a step closer and leaned his head slightly, listening carefully. "I don't like that the alarm is blinking," he said. "It never blinks unless something is wrong." The officer walked to the side of the safe again and gently, very gently touched the top edge. He didn't hear anything this time. He leaned in closer, trying to detect any vibration. That's when he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A very thin line of dried paint near one of the lower corners of the safe door. It was faint, almost unnoticeable, but definitely there. A faded mark from the old trap, probably from the days when the general tested it, sir. The officer said softly, "Did the trap test leave any marks?" The general walked over slowly. When he saw the dried paint, his eyes widened slightly. "That's from the very first test," he said. "I wiped most of it at the time, but I guess a little stayed there. It means the internal valve might still be intact." The officer's eyes followed the faint line of paint. "And if the valve is intact, the pressure system might still be active," the general finished. The officer took a step back slowly this time. He wasn't scared, but he didn't want to be standing right in front of something that might spray at him. It was still harmless, but he didn't want to return to the station covered in paint. He turned to the general. "What do you think we should do now?" The general thought for a long moment. "Maybe we should try opening the safe just a little to release any internal pressure," he said. But very carefully, the officer hesitated. He wasn't sure opening it was a good idea. If the trap was active, even opening the safe slowly might set it off. Still, if they left it alone, it might trigger at any random moment. He rubbed his forehead, thinking. "If we try opening it," he said, "we need to do it from the side, not directly in front," the general agreed. "Yes, and we need to move gently." They took their positions. The general pointed out which side of the safe had the least chance of spraying if the trap activated. The officer approached cautiously and placed his hand on the edge of the handle, not gripping it yet. Before he could move it, he heard a faint popping sound inside the safe. He froze. The general froze. Both of them stared at the safe, waiting to see what came next. The popping sound was followed by a slow hissing noise. Not loud, not urgent, just a subtle release of old air. The officer stepped back. He didn't wait this time. The hiss could mean many things. None of them sounded like something he wanted to be close to. The general stepped back as well, now looking tense. "That hiss," he whispered. "It could mean the pressure is preparing to release." The officer swallowed lightly. "So the trap might activate?" "Possibly," the general said. They waited again. The hissing grew slightly louder, and softened, then stopped entirely. The room was quiet again. The officer exhaled slowly. "I think the system is reacting to the change in temperature or pressure," he said. "Maybe the latch movement." He didn't finish his sentence. A loud, sharp click sounded inside the safe. The officer and the general both stepped back another few feet. This time, there was no mistaking it. The trap had moved into its final position. The officer stared at the safe, his heartbeat picking up slightly. The general's expression turned serious. "It's armed," the general said quietly. The officer nodded. "And it's waiting for one more trigger." Both of them remained completely still. The officer didn't move closer this time. He didn't want to touch anything, breathe too close, or even shift the air around it too much. The general gave a slow sigh. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he said. "It was meant to scare intruders, not the people trying to help." The officer gave a small, understanding smile. "It's all right, sir. These things happen." But inside, he knew part 3 of his day was coming. The moment where whatever was going to happen with the trap would finally happen. For now. Though, the two men stood still, waiting to see what the safe would do next. The room felt heavier than before, as if every corner was holding its breath. The officer stood with his hands slightly raised, palms open, as though even the smallest movement could trigger something. The general stayed near the far wall, his eyes locked on the safe like he was watching an old memory come to life again. Neither of them spoke at first. The safe, with all its age and mystery, seemed to be the one in control now. The officer tried to slow down his breathing and think clearly. He wasn't afraid, just cautious. There was a difference. His job required him to stay calm, even when things didn't make sense. But he had to admit, he hadn't walked into the general's house expecting to deal with a decades-old paint trap. The safe made another soft click. This time the sound was sharper, like a switch snapping into place. The officer took a step back without even thinking. The general straightened his posture slightly, his fingers curling at his sides. The officer finally spoke, keeping his voice low and steady. "Sir, I think the trap is fully active now. Whatever's inside, it's waiting." The general nodded once. "It feels like that," he said quietly. "I should have disabled this years ago. There was no point in blame." Neither of them expected that something placed inside a safe so long ago would suddenly wake up. The officer knew he needed to decide what to do next, but he also understood he couldn't rush. This wasn't a dangerous situation, but it was definitely unpredictable. He moved slowly around the safe again, giving it a wide circle. He didn't touch anything. He just observed. The metal surface remained still. The handle hadn't shifted. The latch he touched earlier was in the same place. But the sounds from inside the winding, the popping, the clicking told him everything was still very much alive. Maybe the pressure built up, the officer murmured, half to himself. Old systems usually react like that. The general nodded again, his expression tense but thoughtful. The paint canister inside was sealed tightly. I remember testing it, but that was a very long time ago. Officer stopped walking and faced him. How exactly does the trap work? The general exhaled slowly, thinking back. When someone pulls on the lock the wrong way or shifts that small latch under it, a spring releases. The spring pushes a valve, which then triggers the spray. It was meant to spray outward in a burst. Harmless but surprising, the officer nodded. And if everything inside still works, then touching anything else might activate it completely. Yes, the general agreed. That's why we need to be careful. The officer looked back at the safe. Wasn't trying to open it anymore. He had no intention of testing the mechanism. All he needed to do was make sure nothing posed a risk, not to the general, not to the property, and definitely not to himself. He stepped back and leaned against the wall opposite the general. The two stayed quiet again, listening to the room. A few minutes passed, long and slow, filled only with the sound of the clock and the faint hum of electricity. Finally, the officer cleared his throat gently. "Sir, maybe we should leave the room for a moment. Let whatever's happening inside settle down." The general nodded immediately. Yes, that might be best. They moved toward the door carefully, making sure not to shake the floor too much or create unnecessary vibrations. When they stepped out of the room, the officer closed the door halfway, not fully shutting it, but enough to create a barrier. They stood in the hallway, both releasing a long breath they had been holding. The general rubbed his forehead with his hand. "I should have remembered exactly how it worked," he said. "It's embarrassing." The officer shook his head gently. "It's all right. These things happen. You were protecting your belongings. There's no harm in that." The general gave a tired smile, appreciating the officer's calm approach. They stayed in the hallway for a few moments, discussing what might be happening inside the safe. The officer suggested waiting for at least 10 minutes before checking again, giving the mechanism time to stop reacting, so they waited. Both stood near a small table in the hallway, leaning against the wall, talking about unrelated things to pass the time. Old service stories from the general, and quiet moments from the officer's experience on duty. The atmosphere slowly relaxed. The officer even started to think maybe the trap had already gone off silently inside the safe, or released its pressure harmlessly. But after 10 minutes, curiosity and responsibility pushed them back to the secure room. The officer stepped inside first, scanning the space with careful eyes. Everything looked exactly the same. The safe stood silent in the center, the blinking light still flashing steadily. The general walked in behind him, just as cautious. "Hey, it looks calm," he said. "Yes," the officer replied. "But we need to check if the noise stopped." The officer moved closer, stopping at a safe distance. He tilted his head slightly, listening. The room was silent. No winding, no popping, no clicking. "It might be done," he said softly. The general released a slow breath. Maybe it reset. The officer took one step forward, just once, so he could lean a little closer and see the latch again. Nothing had shifted. Everything appeared unchanged. He looked down at the floor near the safe to check for anything new: dust, patterns, small drips, anything. Everything was clean. He straightened up and stepped back. "Sir, I think we just need to confirm the safe is stable. I won't touch anything, but I'll take a closer look." The general agreed, staying back but watching attentively. The officer leaned forward again, slowly. He placed his hands on his knees and examined the locking area. There were no cracks or leaks, no pressure sounds, nothing to indicate movement. "Maybe the trap won't activate after all," he whispered. But then something strange happened. A small metallic sound came from deep within the safe, so soft that the officer almost didn't hear it. But it was there. A faint tink. He froze. The general froze. The officer took a slow step backward. He didn't want to be too close in case anything reacted. He held his breath without even knowing he was doing it. The general stepped beside him. "What was that?" he asked quietly. "Something moved inside," the officer replied. The two stood in complete silence for several seconds. The officer could hear his own heartbeat in the quiet room. Then the sound came again, another tiny metallic movement. It's like a lever preparing itself. The general whispered, "That's the trigger setting." The officer's eyes widened slightly. "It's about to go off." The general didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. The officer made the quickest decision he had made all day. "Sir, you need to step back farther."
Behind me.
The general obeyed, moving quickly but without panic. He positioned himself behind the officer, near the door. The officer wasn't planning to be a hero. He just needed to understand what was happening so he could prevent damage. He stepped to the side of the safe knot in front of the door, never in front. He leaned in very slightly, trying to hear what the mechanism was doing. The safe let out a sudden sharp hiss. The officer jerked back instinctively. His shoes slid slightly on the smooth floor, but he kept his balance. The hiss turned into a short burst of air, like a tire releasing pressure. The general called out, "Softly, it's the valve. It's releasing." The officer moved back even more, joining the general near the doorway. Both watched carefully, expecting something to happen. And then, suddenly it did. The safe made a loud, final click that echoed in the secure room. The officer tightened his grip on the doorframe, bracing himself. The general held his breath. A split second later, a powerful burst shot out from the small opening around the safe door. But the officer couldn't see clearly from where he was standing. It happened too fast. All he knew was that the trap inside had come fully to life. A thick, bright spray of paint exploded outward, hitting the front area of the safe with incredible force and spreading into the air in a wide mist. The sound was sharp but brief, a single burst that shook the quiet room. The officer blinked rapidly, not believing what he saw. The paint spray was strong enough to coat the entire front of the safe, splattering far more than either of them expected. Some droplets even reached the edge of the room, landing quietly on the floor. The officer stayed frozen for a moment, processing what had just happened. The general stepped forward slightly and let out a soft, stunned laugh, half relief, half disbelief. "It still works," he whispered. After all these years, the officer shook his head slowly. "It was strong," he said, amazed. The general nodded, still staring at the newly painted safe. "Much stronger than I remember." The officer took a few careful steps forward, still staying off to the side. He examined the splatter pattern on the safe door. The paint was thick and fresh, dripping down the metal surface like a waterfall. He looked at the general. "Sir, that could have hit someone full force." The general looked embarrassed, but also relieved. "I'm just glad no one was standing in front." The officer nodded. "Me too." The trap had finally sprung. Tension in the room dissolved, leaving behind only the surprising colors of the paint and the echo of the burst. The officer stepped back, wiping a tiny droplet from his sleeve. He wasn't covered, thankfully, but he could feel the shock still buzzing in his chest. The general shook his head slowly, still amazed that something built decades ago could fire with such accuracy. "Well," the general said with a small smile, "I suppose that confirms it." The officer let out a breath he had been holding for too long. "Yes, the trap is definitely active." They both stood there, looking at the safe, now painted, dripping, and finally silent. This was just the beginning of the story that would spread far beyond the walls of that quiet house. The officer didn't yet know how the day would end. But he did know this: nothing about this assignment would be forgotten anytime soon. The next morning came quietly, as if the world wanted to give us a slow start after everything that had happened. I woke up before the sun had fully risen, and for a moment, there was a strange calm in the room. It felt like life had paused just long enough for me to gather my breath. But deep inside, I knew the calm would not last. Something was coming. You can always feel it before it arrives. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small cracks on the wall, thinking about the past few days. So much had changed in such a short time. The weight of everything sat heavily on my shoulders, but I wasn't ready to give up. Not when the truth was so close. Not when people were depending on me if they didn't know it. I walked into the living room and found him already awake, sitting near the window with a cup of tea in his hands. He looked tired but steady, like someone who had accepted his place in whatever storm was coming next. "You slept at all?" I asked softly. "A little," he replied, though I could tell it wasn't true. "We have a long day ahead." He didn't say it with fear. He said it the same way someone talks about a job they've done 1,000 times. Calm, focused. Certain, I sat down across from him, taking a slow breath. "Do you think they'll try again?" "They won't try," he said. "They will." Those words settled over the room like a cold shadow. But instead of panicking, I felt something else rise inside me, a strange mix of strength and determination. I had come too far to turn back now. He placed the cup on the table and looked at me in a way that almost felt protective. "You can still walk away from this," he said. "You don't have to stay involved." "I can't walk away," I replied. "If I leave now, the story ends in the dark. I don't want that. Someone has to bring the truth out." He gave a small nod, not of agreement, but of understanding. "Then stay close today. Don't step anywhere alone." I promised him I wouldn't. Around noon, we left the apartment. The sky was overcast, and the air carried a quiet tension that made the streets feel different. Not dangerous, just watchful. As if the city itself was holding its breath. We walked side by side, not speaking much. There wasn't anything left to say. We both knew what we were heading into, even if we didn't know the exact shape of it yet. When we reached the small shop at the corner, the old owner looked at us with a mixture of worry and relief. "You two need to be careful." "Right," he whispered the moment we stepped inside. "People were asking questions again this morning." My pulse quickened. "What kind of questions?" He glanced toward the door as if someone might be listening. "About you." "And about him." He nodded toward the man standing beside me. He stayed silent, but his jaw tightened. The owner lowered his voice even more. One of them kept touching his jacket like he had something inside it. I didn't like the look in his eyes. Chill ran through me. I thanked him quietly, and we left the shop without buying anything. The moment the door closed behind us, the tension in the air grew heavier. "They're getting closer," I said. "They've already found us," he replied. He wasn't afraid. But I could feel the urgency in his voice. We turned down a narrow alleyway that led toward the older part of the neighborhood. The buildings here were aged and uneven, the paint peeling from the walls, but somehow it felt safer than the open streets. He walked slightly ahead of me, scanning every corner, every shadow. I followed, trusting his instincts more than my own. Halfway down the alley, I heard footsteps behind us. Slow at first, then quicker. I turned my head just enough to see two figures approaching. Their faces were blank, but their posture was sharp, alert, purposeful. "They're following us," I whispered. "I know," he said. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He simply motioned for me to stay close, then guided us around a bend where the walls tightened and the noise of the street faded. We walked calmly, pretending not to notice. But the footsteps behind us grew louder. Then everything happened at once. A voice shouted from behind, sharp and commanding. "Stop right there." I froze, but he didn't. He stepped forward, placing himself between me and the two men now blocking the alley. One of them moved his hand toward his pocket, and for a moment my breath caught in my throat. But the man beside me raised his voice before anything escalated. "That's far enough," he said firmly. The tone of his voice changed, steady, powerful, trained. It wasn't the voice of someone hiding. It was the voice of someone who had done this before, someone who had authority. The two men hesitated. Their confidence faltered for a moment. "Who sent you?" he asked. Neither answered. He took one step forward, and the men stepped back. Something in their eyes shifted uncertainty, placing boldness. They didn't want a confrontation. They wanted to intimidate, not fight. One of them muttered something under his breath, then pulled on the other's arm. They turned and walked away quickly, disappearing back into the shadows of the street. I exhaled shakily. Why did they leave like that? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he kept watching the end of the alley until he was sure they were gone. Only then did he turn to me. "They recognized me," he said quietly. Recognized you how? I asked. He looked at me with calm eyes. People like them know when they're outmatched. They know when they've crossed paths with someone trained differently. That answer only brought more questions, but I didn't push. Not yet. We made our way out of the alley, and by the time we reached a quieter street, he finally added, "Their reaction tells me something. Whatever we're dealing with, it's bigger than we thought." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of moving from place to place, trying to stay ahead of anyone who might be watching us. We stopped at a small cafe, sitting in a corner where we could see the entire room. He kept observing everyone who walked in, his eyes sharp and focused. At one point I asked, "Do you think they'll come again today?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "But we won't be here when they do." Evening slowly approached, and we headed back toward the apartment. The sky had darkened, heavy clouds gathering above the city. It looked like rain was coming, and for some reason, that brought a strange feeling of relief. When we reached the building, he stopped before unlocking the door. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. I nodded. He pushed the door open slowly, scanning the room before letting me inside. Everything looked the same as we left it, but he checked every corner anyway. Only after he was sure we were safe did he finally relax. The first raindrops tapped lightly against the window. "You should sit," he said. I sat on the small couch, watching him pace the room with measured steps. After a long moment, he finally said, "I think it's time you knew the truth." My heart began to race, but I stayed still. He took a deep breath. "I didn't come into your story by accident, and the people following us, they're not just random troublemakers." I didn't interrupt. I just waited, he continued. "There's a reason they back down when they see me. And there's a reason they're so desperate to stop you." His voice softened slightly, as if he knew the next part would change everything. "You deserve to know who I really am," he said. He looked right at me, and why none of this happened by chance. The room felt heavier after he said those words, like the air itself understood that something big was about to be revealed. I sat still, waiting, not wanting to interrupt whatever he was gathering the courage to explain. His eyes stayed on me, steady, but weighed down by years of things he had never spoken aloud. "I wasn't just randomly assigned to that case," he finally said. "And none of this started the way you think it did." He took a few slow steps across the room, as if walking helped him find the right words. I watched him carefully. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't scared. He was thoughtful. It's like someone who had carried truth for too long and wasn't sure how to place it down. "I used to work much deeper inside the system than most officers ever go," he said. "Not undercover, not a basic field job, something different. Something that required me to move quietly, watch people carefully, and understand danger before it showed itself." I listened without blinking. He continued. "That safe you were investigating, the one with the strange break-in attempt, the trap, the paint blast. It wasn't just some general being paranoid. It was a deliberate setup, a test. And not everyone was supposed to know about it." The memory of the paint spraying all over him flashed in my mind. How sudden, how strange, how perfectly timed it was. At the time, it looked like a bizarre accident. Now it felt like it had been part of a path neither of us expected. So it wasn't an accident? I asked quietly. "No," he said. "It was designed to expose whoever tried to open it. But it wasn't supposed to be triggered by someone like me." He sat down across from me, folding his hands slowly. "The people behind that safe, they were watching. And they noticed when the trap went off. It alerted them. That's why everything started happening. Everything." "You mean the people following us?" He nodded. "They don't know exactly who is after the truth. They just know someone triggered their security. And now they want to erase any chance of their secrets getting out." I leaned back slightly, trying to absorb everything. "So why are you helping me?" I asked. His answer came without hesitation, "Because I know what it feels like when the truth gets buried.
How?
Deep enough that no one even remembers it existed. And you've been brave enough to chase it even when you didn't understand the danger." His voice softened. "People like you don't come around often." For a moment, the room went quiet except for the distant sound of rain tapping against the window. took a slow breath, and asked the question that had been weighing on me since the very beginning. What exactly is inside that safe? What are they hiding? He didn't look surprised. Maybe he expected the question from the start. It wasn't money, he said. It wasn't jewelry or documents or anything you'd expect. He paused. That safe held information about operations that were never meant to exist. Unauthorized tasks. Unapproved actions. Things that were hidden even from people in high positions. My heart thumped loudly. Are we talking about corruption? I asked. Worse, he said. We're talking about decisions that put people at risk for someone else's gain. He didn't go into detail. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe saying too much in one moment was dangerous. What happens now? I asked. He stood up slowly. Now, we finish what we started, but we have to move before they corner us. The rain outside grew heavier, as if echoing the urgency in his words. He began packing a few things: a small notebook, a folded map, a plain jacket. I realized then that he had been living ready for this moment, even if I hadn't known it. Where are we going? I asked. To the place where the safe was originally transported from, he said. The answers began there. And that's where we'll find the last piece of the story. The building felt colder as we prepared to leave. Every creak of the old wooden floor felt sharper, as if the night itself knew we were stepping into the final part of something much larger than us. We left through the back stairwell. The hallway was dim, lit only by a flickering bulb that made everything look unsettled. The rain outside had turned into a harsh downpour. Soaking the streets and drowning out distant sounds, we moved quietly, staying close to the shadows. About halfway down the block, he stopped suddenly. Don't turn around, he whispered. I froze. What is it? I whispered back, they're here. Those two words sent a wave of fear through me, but I kept myself steady. We need to stay calm, he said. Walk normally. Follow me. We walked forward, our steps blending with the rain. The streetlights cast long reflections on the wet ground, turning the night into a blur of shimmering lines. At the corner, he took my hand not forcefully, but with a quiet protectiveness, and guided me into a narrow passage between two old buildings. We pressed against the wall as footsteps splashed past us. I held my breath. He didn't move. Seconds turned into long, stretched moments. When the footsteps faded, he looked at me and whispered, they're searching every route. They know we're close. Close to what? I thought. The truth. The evidence. Or the moment everything would break open? We continued moving through back paths until we reached a small parking area behind a closed bakery. He pointed toward a plain gray car. That's ours, he said. The car looked old from the outside, but the moment he unlocked it, I could tell it had been maintained with precision. The interior was clean, simple, practical. Did you expect all this to happen? I asked quietly. He shook his head. Not like this. But I always prepare for the worst. Once we were inside, he started the engine without turning on the headlights. The rain was still heavy, making the windshield blur with streaks of water. Where exactly are we going? I asked. To an old storage facility outside the city, he said. Years ago, important items passed through there. If there's anything left that explains the truth, it'll be hidden there. The city slowly faded behind us as he drove. Streetlights turned into long, empty stretches of wet road. The rain softened eventually, turning into a quiet drizzle, as the silence settled in the car. I found myself replaying everything from the first odd clue to the safe explosion to the men following us. Not once did it feel fake or exaggerated. Every moment felt like a piece of a hidden puzzle we were slowly uncovering. After almost an hour, we reached an area filled with old warehouses and tall metal fences. The place looked forgotten by time. He parked near a long building with rusted panels. This is it, he said. We stepped out, the air cool and damp. Stay close, he told me again. The warehouse door creaked loudly when he pushed it open. Inside was darkness, dust, and the faint smell of old wood and metal. He pulled out a small flashlight and swept the beam across the room. This way, he said. We walked past empty crates and broken shelves until we reached the back corner. There, partially hidden behind a wall panel, was a locked metal chest. He knelt beside it. "This belonged to the same general who owned the safe," he said. My heartbeat quickened. "Do you think it has the answers?" "I think it has the truth," he replied. He opened a small toolkit and started working on the lock. The metal clicked softly under his careful hands. For a moment, the world felt frozen. The dark warehouse, the soft echo of rain outside, the quiet determination on his face. Then the lock snapped open. He lifted the lid slowly. Inside was a stack of files, wrapped in plastic, and a small device that looked like a recorder. He looked up at me. "This is it." Just as he reached for the files, a loud clang echoed through the warehouse. Someone had entered. We froze. His eyes met mine. They found us. The story wasn't over. Not yet. It was about to reach the moment everything would unfold the truth. It's the danger and the final outcome neither of us could predict.